In the brief 30 minutes that I have, I was asked to talk about three aspects of strategy: strategy formulation, strategic transformation, and strategy execution. So this is going to be a bit of a quick, breathless talk. So what is strategy about? Well, obviously, strategy is about competition, competing. Now, when you look at this, you may say, well, lions and tigers don't compete because they don't occupy the same territory. That's what Nokia said when Apple brought out its iPhone. Another alternative in strategy is that you could cooperate, as this Egyptian plover bird does, picking decaying bits of flesh from the crocodile. What's the business analogy? This is participating in somebody else's business platform, such as in Google's platform or Microsoft's platform. Just be very careful that the platform operator doesn't close its mouth quickly on you. Strategy also means that sometimes you may face a lethal threat. You may die. Or perhaps not. The rabbit is perhaps Chrysler, which could not be killed off despite Daimler doing its best to do so after acquiring it, and in fact destroying more value than the total amount of money that it paid for Chrysler. Or it could be Dyson, which when it first started with its bagless vacuums, Hoover the giant thought it would just eat it up, but now Dyson's far more successful than Hoover. And in fact, the human resources director of Dyson is in the audience amongst us. So, on this note of a changing world, we all know that previously successful companies have collapsed. So clearly both BlackBerry sold now last week for 5% of its previous peak value of 80 billion, sold for about 5 billion. Nokia out of making mobile phones altogether. RBS, perhaps a bit too painful for a mostly British audience to hear about. But the interesting story from an HR point of view is General Motors. This was a 40-year car crash. You could see this coming for 40 years. And I won't go into and a bit later on I'll perhaps talk a bit about how you have an inertia where you can crash for 40 years and not see it coming. One simple reason was that the directors of General Motors never drove the same cars as their customers. Why was that different? Because every day when they drove it into the company garage in Detroit, it would be serviced. So their cars were always in perfect working condition. So whenever people said, your General Motors cars are not reliable compared to the Japanese, they said, what do you mean? My car is perfect. So make sure that your executives do not have a separate experience from those of your customers. Of course, we must also talk about globalization. So how do we develop strategy for today's world? And what does this represent? What does this map represent? What is it proportional to? Quick answer. GDP. And in fact, it's already out of date because China's GDP, the green one, is so big. Whenever I look at the US one, I always think, this looks like a giant balloon ready for a pin to be burst in there. Look how important Europe still is. I worked in the Netherlands for a while. Netherlands is bigger than most of sub-Saharan Africa. But this is the world of today. What about preparing strategy for the world of tomorrow? And clearly, what is this proportional to? Population. So we're going to move in that direction. And this, of course, has huge human resources implications. Are your companies set up for this world of tomorrow? Is your talent pool, is your board of directors reflective of this percentage? Of course they're not. All right? I'd love to hear from anyone in this room who says their talent pool, their board of directors is proportionally representative to this particular map. All right? And as we're looking at maps, and interesting that Africa still has a lot of pink bits. You remember when half of the African map was pink, showing the color of the British Empire? Well, I'm afraid that Africa is now going from pink to red. China is way ahead of everybody else. Chinese companies are way ahead of everybody else now in the new Africa. And of course, Africa is finally taking off. As the saying goes now, Africa is hot. And you know what was the killer app for Africa? What has been the killer app in the last 10 years for the growth of the African economy? The mobile phone. Right? At a stroke, eliminating the infrastructure problems of Africa. And the simplest example, the farmer who can now phone ahead instead of traveling half a day to the local market, can phone ahead to find out which is the best market to take his or her produce to. And now we're getting mobile payments, again, another killer app to help them. So speaking of China, which is the Chinese company that is the most feared by the West? Somebody whispered Samsung, that's Korean. It is Huawei, and this was the cover story of The Economist in August last year. Huawei, the telecoms company, the US won't allow it to get contracts in the US, or certainly not government contracts, because they're afraid that they'll use the phones to spy into various US networks. Europe is a bit more relaxed about this, but this is a very powerful company in telecoms, telecommunications equipment, investing a huge amount in innovation. And by the way, I'm running a center on innovation in China, so China is moving from imitation to innovation. So if you were afraid of China when they were imitating, you should be even more afraid now that China is innovating. All right, so just some thoughts to shake you up a bit. Let's turn now to something more conceptual. Why does strategy matter? And I'll go on also to define strategy, but for me, strategy matters because effective strategy gets you better performance with fewer resources. Of course, the whole point of business is to get performance, financial performance, and we're always limited in resources, financial resources, people resources. So a better strategy, a more effective strategy, a cleverer strategy gets you better performance. You can think of it as an input-output ratio. You can always do it the dumb way, which is you throw more money at the problem. You can also do it the smart way by having a smart strategy that may avoid head-on competition and some other way in which you get superior performance that way. We also all know that strategy is extremely difficult both to formulate and particularly to implement and to execute. Why is strategy so difficult? And again, this is a very relevant point for human resource directors. If managers were going to do it anyway, you would not need a strategy. So strategy is about getting the organization to do something new, an unnatural act, change, and that's why we always have this problem of getting people to embrace a new strategy. And this is why General Motors took 40 years to wake up to, say, the simple strategy of shifting to fuel-efficient cars. Right? Very hard. It was against their DNA to do this naturally. And again, what is strategy? Have you ever heard someone, your company or somewhere else, saying, our strategy is to be number one? Anybody heard that? Is that a strategy? It is not a strategy. What is it? It's a strategic objective. Nor is it a business model. In fact, a lot of the previous writing on strategy has had us confused. They confuse a business model, which is static, how we are configured to make money, to operate. And even Michael Porter, who was actually my doctoral advisor, I think fell into this trap of a lot of what he calls strategy is actually a static business model linked to a strategic objective such as being number one in the market. What has often been missing are the strategic moves to get you from this business model to the strategic objective. Right? So when someone says our strategic objective has been, our strategy is number one, that's not good enough. What are the moves you're going to make to get there? So a complete strategy combines these three elements of the strategic objective based on the business model and the strategic moves. Now, some strategic objectives, can be very clear, and it's very nice if you have a very clear objective that is memorable, motivational, and memorable. My favorite example is just coming up. When Toyota launched the Lexus division, their strategic objective was to build a car that could compete with Mercedes, BMW, the luxury brands, the very best in the world. And they put up a slogan in every factory and design room, 2 words in English: beat Benz. Memorable, motivational, measurable, and they succeeded. Furthermore, they were able to do something that General Motors and Ford would have loved to do, and I don't even dare mention British Leyland, but they were not capable of doing it. They were capable of doing it. They spent 10 years investing to launch the Lexus, and Nissan did the same with the Infiniti division. Clear objectives help. Having a clear enemy also helps. Who is this enemy? From the greatest television commercial ever created, popularly voted the best TV commercial ever created. Having a clear enemy helps when you're a challenger. This is from the same TV commercial. Which TV commercial is this? And who is the enemy? IBM is the enemy. Apple is the challenger. And what was the TV commercial for? Announcing the launch of the Macintosh, January 1984, and the voiceover said, and the reason why 1984 won't be like 1984. Right? So IBM was Big Brother. Apple has been always very good at having an enemy. It was IBM, now IBM has fallen by the wayside. The new enemy is Microsoft, and probably the next enemy is Google and Android. So setting up the company emotionally to execute strategy makes a big difference. I actually came across one CEO who referred to himself not as the chief executive, but as the chief emotional officer of the company. Perhaps you as the HR directors, you can be the chief emotional officer. All right, let's go back to something more conceptual again. And there's a very nice framework from an article last year in Harvard Business Review that says there's more than one style for formulating strategy. In the bottom left-hand box is what we call classical strategy, such as oil companies have. The environment has got high predictability, except for a few shocks that you might get now and then. And it's low malleability, which is you can't change the environment very much. So you have this sort of classic Michael Porter type strategy that oil companies, auto companies might have. But there are actually three other types of combinations. If you move to the top left box, the environment could be unpredictable, nor can you control it very much. So now you need an adaptive strategy, such as a fashion retailer, that tends to have to go with the flow and adapt to that. So both Benetton and Zara are very famous for having these adaptive strategies, and don't have time to go into details of that. But on the right-hand side, high malleability, where you can change the environment now. On the top right, not very predictable, like many internet services, you can sort of shape the strategy, create something that will work in the marketplace. The interesting one is the bottom right, the visionary strategy. You can change the market. It is predictable. So Tata's launch of the Nano, highly affordable car, they've stumbled a bit in doing that, but it is possible to have a highly visionary strategy as well. And again, think of the implications for human resources. You need different types of people to develop these different types of strategy. And of course, companies also get into trouble when their environment changes, as we know today, mostly from high predictability to low predictability, and also from low malleability to high malleability. And who usually changes the environment? The newcomers, not the incumbents. The incumbents are too slow to see that changes are possible. Hence, we have now what a new article this year calls transient advantage. Of course, we're all familiar with the notion that advantage rises then disappears, except that it now happens faster and faster. So no longer think about sustainable competitive advantage, but how can you develop a series of transient competitive advantages that you keep developing more and more. And again, an HR implication, you actually need different types of people for each of these stages. So for the launch stage, you probably need experimenters, entrepreneurs. For the ramp-up stage, you need people who can assemble the resources to put together a business. For the exploit stage, of course, you need the classic efficient managers, of which companies have many. In the reconfiguring stage, you need the radical thinkers to radically rethink how the business should change. And in the final disengaged stage, you need very tough-minded people who are willing to cut jobs, cut businesses. And again, most companies don't have a good mix of those types of people, nor are they able to change the type of person, change the CEO, change the senior management as the company or the business goes through the different stages. So a quick summary of the things you should think about, the new playbook for transient advantage. Don't think about industries, but think about the arenas in which you might operate. So going as far back as Merrill Lynch's launch of the cash management account blindsided the banks who didn't realize that here could be a new competitor thinking about cash management needs rather than checking accounts or current accounts, right? The broad space. Broad themes, letting people experiment. This is the classic loose-tight organization. And I really see this in China. So China tends to be very tight, and they need to loosen up. So set the broad themes, but let people experiment within that. So companies like Google are very good at that. Adopt metrics that support entrepreneurial growth. So net present value with a terminal value doesn't encourage that kind of thinking. If you'd done an NPV on the Apple iPhone, they would never have launched it. Right? So think of real options instead. We do something that creates a real option. Focus on experiences and solutions to problems, because products are imitated too easily, but a total experience such as the Apple Store. By the way, Apple Store is so popular in China, there are now not just fake Apple products, there are fake Apple stores. Even the employees do not know that they're not working for Apple. That is true flattery. They imitate the entire store. Build strong relationships and networks at all the communities, platforms. Someone like TripAdvisor is a community. Avoid brutal restructuring and learn healthy disengagement. So the Indian company Infosys gradually phases out of new activities, unlike Netflix's huge stumble when it tried to jump from physical mailing of the DVDs to entirely online. It did it much too quickly. Get systematic about early stage innovation. As we know, and we'll hear more later in the conference from other speakers, most big companies are very bad at innovation. You need to be systematic about it. And last of all, experiment, iterate, learn, because as one guru said, the ultimate source of competitive advantage is to be able to learn faster than your competitors. So, the agile company that learns faster than your competitors. So, just to summarize this, your company has to keep developing new sources of competitive advantage, and there will be bumps along the way. And as you do this, sometimes you may even have to do a strategic transformation. So this next slide shows two primary uses of strategy. One is to change the market or other position within the current business model. And so that's why I've got the same shape, one triangle to a slightly bigger triangle. I call this an incremental strategy. But the other major type is to change the business model. So the circle to the diamond, a different shape. This is a transformational or a radical strategy. Why are you doing this? You're going because the environment has changed on you. Which one is the higher rate of success? The incremental strategy or the transformational radical strategy? Right. Clearly, the incremental strategy has a much higher rate of success. It is much easier to do, and it is based on your existing strengths. You're not giving up your previous strengths. By the way, the reason why strategy often has a bad reputation is that people think about the failures of radical strategies. By definition, radical strategies have a low success rate, probably less than 50%, because you're forced into it because of the change in the environment, whereas the incremental strategies have a much higher rate of success. Now, why do companies like General Motors get stuck and cannot change their strategy easily? So this blue line shows the environment changing sometimes slowly and in the middle part accelerating the change. What are companies good at? Companies are good at incremental change. In phase one, the gap between where the company ought to be and where it is isn't that great, so things are okay. But as change in the environment accelerates, they get strategic drift, continuing incremental change, a big gap now. At this point, they say, my God, we have to change, and they go into strategic flux. This is when they bring in the management consultants. As a former management consultant, thank you very much. We need lots more of companies in flux. And what happens with the CEO? They usually replace the CEO at this point. And then we either get transformational change or demise. And of course, companies get locked into this mindset either because they're highly resistant to change or they become arrogant, like Icarus. Past success breeds future failure. You get locked into what you are good at. When the iPhone first came out, Nokia was discussing it, and one executive picked up the iPhone, dropped it on the floor, it broke, and he said, see, we don't have to worry about the iPhone. And this happens again and again. And companies just cannot change very fast. And this was summed up best of all by perhaps the most famous CEO of all time, for me, Jack Welch of General Electric. When the rate of change inside the company is exceeded by the rate of change outside the company, the end is near. And again, I hold you, the HR directors, responsible for this. You have to develop the people, recruit the people who are able to get the company to change faster than the outside environment. Oh, and by the way, you need to change the evaluation and compensation systems also to go with the change in the environment. And in my research, I found that changing the compensation system is the hardest thing that a company can do. So how do you tell when your company needs strategic transformation? Well, it's very hard to tell the boss you're doing the wrong thing. Right? As it says here, I'd like to question the leadership on this one. Shut up, you're undermining the troops. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt because as they were losing money trading bonds, the only thing they knew how to do was to trade more bonds. Keep rushing over the cliff like the lemmings. So strategic transformation has also been described as like trying to make elephants dance. Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, if you succeed, it's very effective. I've been trying to figure out what is the role of HR people in relation to this elephant dance. Some colleagues of mine at Capgemini Consulting, this a while back, they have a wonderful model for strategic transformation, an analogy between improving the human body and improving the organization. You can study this a bit more when you download it, but it's basically 4 categories. Reframing, which is sort of the mental part, giving a new vision to the company, which is the first quadrant. Second quadrant is restructuring, sort of the physical part, realigning the physical body, realigning the physical operations of the company. The third quadrant is the revitalizing, which includes in the human being, the reproductive system, the nervous system, the senses, and in the company, inventing new businesses, achieving market focus, and so on. And then the last quadrant on the top left, renewing, developing the organization a sense of community, self-actualization. And of course, I hope many of you recognize who this figure is. Who is it? Yeah, not a Spanish artist, an Italian artist, Leonardo Da Vinci. So perhaps my favorite example of a successful transformation, actually, which I use in China, because China has a lot of so-called state-owned enterprises who are in a state that needs strategic transformation. So I say, well, you know, the British succeeded in transforming one particular state-owned enterprise that was really bad before. Any guesses? Of course, we have many to choose from. Transformation of British Airways. State-owned until 1982. What did BA stand for? Bloody awful. So, of course, as an example of this, one of the rules for flight attendants in their handbook said this: as you walk down the aisle, do not catch the eye of a passenger, otherwise they will just ask you for something. So, privatization, they bring in a new CEO, Colin Marshall, from a British guy, but who'd run Avis, which was famous for "We're number 2, we try harder." By the way, Avis has been trying harder for 30 years. Where are they now? They're number 3. So they should have tried different, but that's another story, okay? So trying harder is often not enough. So one of the first things he does, he comes up with a new advertising campaign and a new slogan. What was the new tagline? British Airways, the world's favorite airline. The customers and the employees said, "You must be joking." But of course, he raised the bar that the customers expected the airline to live up to, and even more important, that the staff had to live up to. Right? And so, of course, he trained them to improve their service, to greet the customers by name, to smile at people, very unnatural act for the British. But he did get them to do one thing the British are very good at. He got the staff to apologize. So things still went wrong, but whenever they went wrong now, the British Airways staff would apologize. And so this was using a British strength, the apology. And I experienced this a couple of times myself. They lost my baggage, but she was very apologetic. And indeed, I felt better after all these apologies. More practical things, product innovation. He said, you know, business class travel across the Atlantic is not about getting the best beefsteaks and the best champagne. It is about what? Getting the best night's sleep. Once he redefined it that way, you serve dinner before the flight, you give them flatbed seats, you serve breakfast in the lounge after the flight, and you offer them a shower. Okay? So redefine it, the first ones to think that way. As a result, they became number 1 among world business travelers, voted number 1 many years in a row, and still one of the world's best airlines. So we decided to study, I and a couple of colleagues decided to study strategic transformation, a book that we published in January, of how can companies achieve strategic transformation without the trauma of financial disasters. And just to cut it short, we focused on 3 companies, one of which was Tesco, the old Tesco, pilot high, sell it cheap, which went through a strategic transformation, an initial business model, sort of corporate diversification, alternative management coalitions within the company. There are a lot of managerial implications, alternative strategic directions, corporate business realignment, and going from the pilot high, sell it cheap to the Tesco superstore. But even Tesco can stumble, as we've just seen this week, with what happened in the United States. So they then started to suffer from hubris as well. Another company we identified was Smith & Nephew, 100 years of evolving their business model, and now they're a global medical technology company that can survive and fight it out with the American giants. What we found that the speedy transformation requires some emotional growing up, safe opportunities for hot debates. Young managers can present alternative views. It's not dominated by just the senior leadership. Some lessons we found: developing traditions for transformation, how to speed this up. Build on the history of the company. Don't ignore the history. Select and develop a new generation of leaders, and accept and encourage constructive mobility. People can move in and out, and can move out sort of without anger. Ensure that decision-making allows for dissent. Unlike the former chief executive of MGM who once said, "I want people around me who will tell me I'm wrong, even if it costs them their job." I hope none of your bosses like that. Or my Chinese father who once said to me, "Son, you should never contradict me, especially when I'm wrong." Create enabling structures that actually encourage tension in the company, but constructive tension. But expect everyone to get behind decisions once they're made. Develop an overarching rationale for what the company is about that everybody understands. And beware of market size and dominance, which was this perhaps Tesco going too far. And let me finish up with a few slides on the third topic, strategy execution. Of course, you must be able to execute the strategy successfully as well. So a quick review of the 7 essential behaviors of strategy execution. I really recommend this book by Larry Bossidy and Ram Charan. I teach it in my courses. He's a former chief executive of Honeywell, and Ram Charan is a business academic. Know your people, know your business. The follow-through perhaps being the most important part, and knowing yourself, and so on. Let me just jump to the role of the leader in execution. Running the 3 core processes: the strategy formulation, the operations, and the people part. Putting the right people in place. The book says you need to spend about, the chief executive needs to spend what percentage of his or her time on people issues? Well, the book said about a third. Okay, no. So 65%, I guess you're hopeful that they'll spend that much of their time on that. But still, absolutely essential. And I like the third point, which is only if the right people focus on the right details at the right time. Now, of course, the chief executive can make a huge difference. Here's one chief executive who has made a big difference, the $15 billion woman. Who is this woman? Who is it? Marissa Mayer. Of which company? Right. Yahoo. So she's been in post just over a year. She's doubled the market cap of the company from 15 to 30 billion, $15 billion woman. What has she done? In fact, nothing that dramatic. She steadied the ship, launched many more new products, but perhaps more important, she was a techie, which is what the company seems to need right now. And just in the interest of gender equality, I have a $15 billion man. Who is this? He increased the value of his company by one action in one day by $15 billion. How did he do that? He announced his retirement. Ouch. And of course, the message here of these 2 last slides, you've got to have the right person at the right time. Steve Ballmer was the right person for a long time. He is no longer the right person for that job. And what is your role in getting the right kind of $15 billion chief executive? Have the right view of your employees. How about this quote? "I consider every one of my employees to be a liability." A chief executive said this. Scott McNally of Sun Microsystems said this. And what he meant, of course, was that not only liabilities, but they're also responsible for their own development. How about this one? "As human beings are also animals, to manage 1 million animals gives me a headache." Who said this? Terry Gao, chief executive of the Taiwanese company Hon Hai Precision. Getting any warmer? What does his company do? His subsidiary is Foxconn. What does Foxconn do? They make apples. And suicides. I'll refer to the suicides in a moment. Here's a dormitory. Why are the dormitories important in the Foxconn factories? When Apple calls in an urgent order, because they're sleeping at the factory, they wake them up at 3 a.m. to go and work in the factory. Would you like to be able to do that in your companies? Could you put in that kind of policy? By the way, last year they had many suicides, people jumping off the top of the buildings. To be fair, it turns out the suicides were not any greater than, when you have 1 million people of that kind of age. However, when Terry Gao was questioned in a press conference 2 weeks later, what are you doing about the suicides? He replied, no problem, there'll be no more suicides. People said, how's that? He said, oh, we've put nets up around the tops of the buildings. If only you could solve all your HR problems so easily. And it also shows a certain mindset about human resources management. Just to give you a bit more flavor about China that also relates to your companies and the problem of strategy execution, why do things not get executed? Because, of course, the managers, the local people, ignore headquarters. Right? They don't like to listen to headquarters. And in China, there's a very famous saying that translates the relationship between headquarters and the people in the field. The mountain is high and the emperor is far away. Think how that might translate to your own company. In this case, it's a local bureau trying to talk to a distant provincial capital and saying, you guys are far away, I'm going to do my own thing. So in your company, what is the manifestation of this problem? The mountain is high and the emperor is far away. Let me close with these 3 comments. A strategy is a journey, not a destination. The best strategy ideas are the outcome of a creative process that's strongly grounded in deep knowledge and understanding of both the external and internal environment. Often you need some creativity as well in coming up with the best strategy ideas. And who is going to come up with the best strategy ideas? And last of all, the best strategies are also successfully executed. Thank you very much.